Hi guys. Tonight we begin a quiet journey into one of the most turbulent stories of the 20th century, the life of Leon Trotsky. He was a man who believed that ideas could change the course of nations, who helped ignite a revolution that reshaped the world, and who spent his final years watching that same revolution turn against him. This is the story of belief, exile, and the price of conviction. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Leon Trotsky was born Lev Davidovich Bronstein on November 7th, 1879, in a small Ukrainian village called Yanovka, then part of the Russian Empire. His family were prosperous Jewish farmers, independent and educated, an unusual combination at that time. From a young age, Trotsky showed a sharp mind and a restless curiosity. He read everything he could find, and by his teenage years he was already drawn to the radical ideas spreading through Europe. Ideas of equality, revolution, and the struggle against oppression. He left home early, moving to Odessa to study, and it was there, in the bustling port city filled with political energy, that he first encountered Marxist circles. Those gatherings, half discussion, half rebellion, would define the rest of his life. By the age of 20, Trotsky was already involved in underground revolutionary activity. In 1898, he was arrested for organizing a workers' group and spent 2 years in prison before being exiled to Siberia. The isolation could have broken him, but instead it became a period of transformation. In exile, he met Alexandra Sokolovskaya, a fellow revolutionary whom he married. Together they shared not only love but also a commitment to the same cause, the belief that Russia could become a just and equal society. During those cold years in Siberia, Trotsky began to write. His thoughts were clear, passionate, and driven by logic. He analysed not only the injustices of the Tsarist regime but also the weaknesses within the revolutionary movement itself. His words carried both intellect and emotion, a rare balance that would later make him one of the most influential voices in Russian politics. In 1902, he escaped from Siberia using a false passport under the name Trotsky, the name of one of his jailers. It was a symbolic act, taking the identity of his captor to free himself. From that moment on, he would be known to history not as Bronstein, but as Trotsky, the revolutionary. He fled to London, where he met Vladimir Lenin and other exiled revolutionaries who were publishing Iskra, the Spark, a Marxist newspaper intended to spread revolutionary thought across Russia. Trotsky's writing impressed everyone who read it. His articles were analytical, powerful, and deeply human. He wrote not just about politics, but about people, about their hopes, fears, and capacity for change. Even among intellectuals, he stood out for his clarity and fire. Yet from the very beginning, there was a tension between Trotsky and Lenin. Both men believed in revolution, but they differed in how it should be achieved. Lenin envisioned a tightly controlled party of professional revolutionaries, disciplined, centralized, and loyal to leadership. Trotsky, on the other hand, believed that the revolution must grow organically, led by the masses themselves, not dictated from above. This early divide would echo throughout their lives. In 1903, when the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party split into two factions, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, Trotsky refused to fully side with either. He tried to mediate, to unite them, believing unity was more important than purity of ideology. But history, as it often does, moved in sharper lines. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, would soon dominate. Still, Trotsky's reputation as a brilliant orator and writer continued to rise. His speeches could move crowds of thousands, not with fiery slogans, but with reasoned passion. He spoke like a man who believed words could truly alter destiny, and for a time, they did. That belief, that fusion of intellect and conviction, would carry him through revolutions, wars, betrayals, and exile. But it would also, slowly and inevitably, lead him to his downfall. When Leon Trotsky returned to Russia in 1905, The empire was trembling. The Russo-Japanese War had just ended in humiliating defeat, and discontent spread like smoke through every city and factory. Workers were striking, peasants were rioting, and for the first time in centuries the unshakable power of the Tsar seemed fragile. Trotsky, now in his mid-20s, arrived in St. Petersburg determined to take part in the uprising that was unfolding. He believed it could become the beginning of a true revolution, one that would change not only Russia but the world. The first thing that struck him was the energy of the people. Factories were silent, streets were filled with banners, and meetings happened in secret rooms and public squares alike. Trotsky quickly became one of the most prominent voices in the movement. His ability to speak clearly and calmly in moments of chaos gave him a kind of authority that even older revolutionaries respected. He joined the St. Petersburg Soviet, a newly formed council representing the city's workers, and soon he was elected as its chairman. It was a remarkable rise, from a Siberian exile to the leader of a mass political body in just a few years. The 1905 revolution was spontaneous, messy, and unprepared. It began after the tragedy of Bloody Sunday, when peaceful demonstrators were shot by the Tsar's soldiers. Outrage spread like wildfire. Strikes erupted across the empire, and the Soviets tried to coordinate them, but communication was fragile, and trust among leaders was thin. Trotsky, though still young, showed a rare ability to bring order to chaos. His speeches encouraged courage, but warned against blind violence. He believed that revolution must be conscious, not simply a burst of anger, but a movement built on awareness and purpose. For several months, the Soviet acted as a kind of shadow government in the capital. It organized food distribution, published its own newspaper, and issued demands for political reform. For a brief time, it felt as if Russia was living between two worlds, the old one ruled by the Tsar and the new one led by the workers. Trotsky stood in the center of that fragile balance, believing that history was finally turning in their favor. But the state, even wounded, remained powerful. In December 1905, the uprising was crushed by troops loyal to the Tsar. The Soviet was dissolved, and Trotsky was arrested again. During his trial, he refused to show fear. Instead, he used the courtroom as a stage, delivering one of his most famous speeches, not in defense of himself, but of the revolution. "You may imprison us," he said calmly, "but the revolution you fear has already entered your own hearts." Those words echoed far beyond the courtroom walls. He was sentenced once more to exile in Siberia, but this time he didn't stay long. In 1907 he escaped again, crossing frozen rivers and hiding under false papers until he finally reached freedom. For the next decade, Trotsky lived mostly abroad, in Vienna, Paris, and later New York. He became an international journalist, writing for socialist newspapers and studying revolutions in other countries. His mind was always restless, always searching for patterns, why some uprisings failed and others succeeded. In Vienna he lived modestly, often in poverty, but his small apartment became a gathering place for young radicals and thinkers. He edited a paper called Pravda, The Truth, long before Lenin would later claim the name for his own publication. Trotsky wrote endlessly about economics, class struggle, war, and the psychology of revolution. His language was calm but charged with insight. He didn't only argue for a better world, he explained in detail how it might be built. As Europe moved toward World War I, Trotsky warned that such a conflict would destroy empires and awaken the working class. His predictions were chillingly accurate. When the war finally began in 1914, millions were sent to die, and Russia's suffering deepened beyond measure. Trotsky, watching from exile, believed the end of the old order was near. The storm he had long awaited was coming, and soon it would bring him back to Russia once again. When Trotsky returned to Russia in the spring of 1917, the world he had dreamed of overturning was already collapsing. The February Revolution had just forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, and after centuries of autocracy, Russia suddenly found itself without a ruler. The streets of Petrograd were crowded with soldiers who no longer obeyed their officers, with workers who no longer feared their bosses. It was chaos, but to Trotsky, it was also a moment of boundless possibility. He had arrived from New York, where he'd been writing articles about the global revolution for small socialist newspapers. Now, after years of exile, he stepped off the ship and felt something electric in the air, a sense that history itself was moving. He later wrote that the smell of revolution was as real as the salt wind that greeted him at the port. At first, Trotsky wasn't aligned with any single party. He was cautious, watching as factions within the socialist movement fought for dominance. The provisional government had taken power, promising democracy and reform, but it continued Russia's involvement in the disastrous World War I. Soldiers were starving, cities were exhausted, and the promises of freedom felt like fragile illusions. When Trotsky heard that Lenin had returned from Switzerland and was calling for all power to the Soviets, he knew immediately where he belonged. The two men, who had once disagreed bitterly, now found themselves drawn together by the urgency of the moment. Trotsky joined the Bolsheviks in July 1917. Within weeks, his charisma and organisational brilliance made him one of Lenin's closest allies. He became chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, the same revolutionary body he had led during the failed uprising of 1905. This time, though, the stakes were far greater. The Bolsheviks were planning a seizure of power, and Trotsky became the strategist of that daring move. He organised the Military Revolutionary Committee, coordinated the Red Guards, and planned every detail of the October uprising. When it began, it was swift and almost bloodless. The provisional government was swept aside with barely a fight. Trotsky directed the takeover of key buildings, telegraph offices, railway stations, the Winter Palace, all with a sense of calm precision. In those days, his speeches were legendary. Witnesses described how crowds stood in silence as he spoke, his voice measured but burning with certainty. "We are not conspirators," he said. "We are the revolution itself." When Lenin later declared victory, it was Trotsky's careful planning that had made it possible. In just a few months, he had gone from an exile to one of the most powerful men in Russia. But the new regime faced impossible challenges. The country was starving, the economy collapsing, and foreign armies were closing in. Trotsky was appointed People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, charged with negotiating peace with Germany. He hoped for a revolutionary peace, an end to war that would inspire uprisings across Europe. Instead, he faced humiliation. The Germans demanded vast territories, and Lenin, desperate to save the revolution, insisted on signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Trotsky delayed for weeks, refusing to surrender Russia's dignity, but eventually he had no choice. His phrase, "neither war nor peace," a diplomatic standoff that fooled no one, became a symbol of that bitter moment. After the treaty, Lenin reassigned him to a more urgent mission, the creation of a new army. Russia had no functioning military left, only scattered groups of armed workers and peasants. Trotsky threw himself into the task with astonishing energy. Travelling across the country by armoured train, he rebuilt discipline, reintroduced ranks, and recruited former Tsarist officers under strict political supervision. The army he forged, the Red Army, would soon face its greatest test in the coming civil war. In those long months, Trotsky lived almost without rest. He slept in his train, wrote orders by lantern light, and gave speeches to exhausted soldiers in the snow. To many, he became the voice of the revolution's iron will, stern, brilliant, unyielding. Yet behind his intensity lay a man who believed still that all this blood and sacrifice would someday lead to a world of justice. For now, though, war was the only language left. The Russian Civil War began like a storm that refused to end. After the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, the country broke apart into dozens of warring factions, monarchists, liberals, foreign armies, and regional movements, all united only by their desire to destroy the new Soviet government. In that chaos, Leon Trotsky became the architect of survival. Appointed Commissar of War, he had to build an army from ruins, to forge discipline where there was only confusion. The Red Army started with almost nothing. No proper uniforms, no training, no supplies. Many soldiers were peasants who barely understood what they were fighting for. Trotsky knew that speeches alone couldn't win. He needed structure, fear, and belief. He travelled endlessly in his armoured train, a moving command post equipped with telegraph lines, a printing press, and guards who followed his every word. It became both symbol and sanctuary, a headquarters on wheels from which he directed battles across a collapsing nation. Trotsky reinstated strict military discipline, even using former Tsarist officers to train the new soldiers, though they were carefully watched by political commissars loyal to the revolution. It was a risky move. Many Bolsheviks distrusted the old officers, but Trotsky argued that revolution didn't mean rejecting competence. You cannot improvise an army from enthusiasm alone, he said. Under his leadership, order slowly emerged. Red banners replaced scattered flags, and units began to move as one. He was a demanding leader, brilliant, merciless, and sometimes terrifying. When troops retreated without orders, he ordered executions to restore discipline. When morale faltered, he gave speeches that reignited conviction. Soldiers said that when Trotsky arrived, exhaustion disappeared for a while. His presence carried weight. He seemed to embody the revolution's will to survive. Still, he was not blind to suffering. In private letters, he wrote about the unbearable human cost of the war, about villages burned and lives lost. Yet he convinced himself that this pain was temporary, that out of destruction would rise a new and fairer world. The battles were brutal. The White Army, supported by Britain, France, and Japan, advanced from all sides. The Red Army faced starvation, disease, and desertion, but Trotsky's relentless organization held them together. He often appeared on the front lines, standing on the roof of his train, speaking through the roar of artillery. Witnesses said his calm voice cut through the chaos like steel. In 1920, the tide finally turned. The Red Army pushed back its enemies, retaking lost cities one by one. Victory was not glorious. It was cold, weary, and stained with too much death, but it meant survival. When the Civil War ended, Trotsky was one of the most powerful men in the new Soviet Union, second only to Lenin. His achievements were undeniable. He had saved the revolution from collapse. Yet the same qualities that had made him indispensable, his intellect, independence, and pride, also made him dangerous to others in power. Inside the Communist Party, rivalries were already forming. Lenin, gravely ill, began to worry about what would happen after his death. Trotsky seemed the natural successor, admired by many as the true leader of the revolution. But another man was quietly building his own power, Joseph Stalin, the cautious bureaucrat who knew how to wait. For Trotsky, the years of war had left him both victorious and isolated. The revolution had survived, but it was changing. The ideals that had once seemed pure were becoming rigid, administrative, cold. And somewhere deep inside he sensed that the next battle he would face would not be fought on the front lines, but within the very heart of the movement he had helped create. By 1922, the revolution that had once burned with hope was hardening into something darker. The Civil War was ending, the Red Army stood victorious, but the cost had been immense. Millions dead, famine spreading, and cities in ruins. Within the Soviet leadership, exhaustion mixed with ambition. Lenin, weakened by strokes, watched as the state he had built began to shift under the weight of power. Around him, his closest comrades manoeuvred quietly, each shaping the future to their own vision. Among them, Trotsky remained the most famous and the most feared. He was the hero of the revolution's battles, a gifted orator, a man whose name still inspired loyalty. But he was also proud, impatient, and often distant from those who might have supported him. Trotsky's relationship with Lenin had always been complex, bound by shared purpose, divided by temperament. They respected each other deeply, even when they disagreed. But as Lenin's health declined, their alliance began to fracture. Trotsky pushed for rapid modernization, for international revolution, for ideas too grand and dangerous for a country still bleeding. Others, especially Stalin, preferred something slower, more practical, and above all under tighter control. Stalin, as General Secretary, quietly built networks of loyalty inside the party. While Trotsky inspired crowds, Stalin organized committees. Step by step, he turned the machinery of bureaucracy into his weapon. In Lenin's final writings, there were signs of alarm. He warned of Stalin's growing power and suggested that Trotsky was the only one capable of restraining him. But before those warnings could become action, Lenin was silenced by another stroke in early 1924. He never recovered. The revolution's first leader was gone, and with his death began a struggle for its soul. The funeral marked a turning point. Trotsky, bedridden with illness far from Moscow, did not attend, a decision that would haunt him forever. Stalin took control of the ceremony, standing beside Lenin's coffin as if inheriting his mantle. To the public it looked like unity. Behind the scenes, it was the beginning of betrayal. In the months that followed, Stalin, Zinoviev and Kamenev formed a triumvirate against Trotsky, painting him as arrogant, detached, and dangerously ambitious. They accused him of underestimating the party, a subtle way of saying he stood above it. Trotsky's influence began to slip. Though he still held his position in the government, he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. His speeches were brilliant but no longer effective. The applause grew quieter. The revolution he had helped win was changing shape, becoming bureaucratic, fearful, obedient. He saw it happening and warned that the ideals of 1917 were being suffocated, that the new Soviet state was becoming the very thing it had once sought to destroy. But his words were met with silence. By the end of 1925, Stalin's control over the party apparatus was nearly complete. Trotsky was removed as Commissar of War, a symbolic act that ended his command of the army he had created. He knew what it meant. He was being erased piece by piece. Still, he refused to retreat into safety. He wrote essays criticizing the growing authoritarianism, defending the idea of permanent revolution, the belief that socialism could not survive in one country alone. Those writings would become his legacy, but at the time they sealed his fate. Alone, isolated and under constant attack, Trotsky began to sense that his greatest enemy was no longer outside the revolution, but within it. And the man leading that quiet purge, patient and methodical, was already preparing to push him into exile. By 1926, the divide between Trotsky and Stalin had become irreversible. The revolution that once united them was now a battlefield of ideology and power. Trotsky's belief in permanent revolution, the idea that socialism must spread beyond Russia to survive, clashed violently with Stalin's new doctrine of socialism in one country. To Trotsky, that phrase was heresy, a betrayal of everything 1917 had stood for. He argued that the revolution could not remain isolated behind borders, that it would stagnate and decay. Stalin, however, understood something Trotsky didn't, that the people were tired. They wanted stability, not endless struggle. He offered them a vision of strength and security, wrapped in the language of patriotism. It was a message that worked. Inside the Communist Party, Stalin's network grew. He controlled appointments, decided who advanced, who disappeared, who stayed silent. Meetings became cautious, conversations watched. Trotsky, once admired for his brilliance, now seemed dangerous, a reminder of an unpredictable past. Together with Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had temporarily broken with Stalin, Trotsky tried to form the united opposition, calling for democracy within the party and warning against dictatorship. But it was already too late. Stalin turned their words against them, accusing them of factionalism and treason. Trotsky continued to speak, even as the crowds thinned. His voice still carried the same calm conviction, but fewer dared to listen. In 1927, on the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution, he marched at the back of the parade in Moscow, surrounded by silent supporters, holding hidden banners that read, "Down with bureaucratic degeneration." It was an act of quiet defiance, and the regime noticed. Shortly after, Trotsky and his allies were expelled from the party. The man who had helped create the Soviet Union was now officially branded an enemy of it. He was first sent into internal exile in Alma-Ata, in the far reaches of Kazakhstan. The journey there felt like the closing of a circle. Another exile, another lonely frontier. But this time, there would be no easy escape. The isolation was complete. He lived modestly, with his wife Natalia, reading, writing, and caring for his health. Even in exile, he continued to send essays to foreign newspapers, analysing the decay of the revolution and warning the world of Stalin's growing tyranny. The letters were smuggled out by friends, some of whom vanished soon after. In early 1929, Stalin made the final move. Trotsky was stripped of his Soviet citizenship and permanently expelled from the country. He crossed the border into Turkey, carrying little more than books, papers, and a few clothes. For the first time in his life, he had no homeland to return to. From that moment on, he became the most famous exile in the world. A revolutionary without a revolution. Yet even in defeat, Trotsky refused to be silent. He rented a small house on the island of Principo near Istanbul, where he began to write his monumental memoirs. There, surrounded by the sea, he reflected on the battles he had fought, the ideals he had lost, and the comrades who had turned into enemies. Visitors described him as calm, disciplined, and strangely peaceful. Though his mind remained as sharp as ever, he still believed that history would one day vindicate him. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, Stalin was rewriting that history entirely. Photographs were edited, names erased, and textbooks rewritten. Trotsky's image disappeared from official records, his role in the revolution reduced to a footnote. But outside the Soviet Union, his voice continued to reach readers and thinkers around the world. The man Stalin tried to erase was still writing, still warning, and still waiting. From his small house on the island of Principo, Trotsky tried to rebuild his life among silence and seagulls. The sea surrounded him like a border he could never cross. The years of war and power had been replaced by long days of reading, writing, and reflection. He woke early, dictated letters to his secretary, and spent hours walking along the rocky shore. Though physically safe for the first time in years, he lived under the constant weight of isolation. His enemies ruled his homeland, his friends were scattered or dead, and his name was being erased from the revolution he had helped to create. Yet Trotsky's mind refused to rest. He wrote endlessly, essays, letters, and books that analysed the nature of dictatorship and the corruption of ideals. His memoir, My Life, was both a defence and a confession, tracing his journey from the dusty fields of Yanovka to the storm of 1917. He wrote with the same sharp precision that had once moved crowds, but now his audience was the world. Western intellectuals saw him as a tragic figure, the brilliant revolutionary betrayed by his own creation. From exile, Trotsky began his campaign against Stalin's rule. He denounced the growing terror, the censorship, and the purges already beginning to take shape. He called Stalin the gravedigger of the revolution, warning that the Soviet Union was turning into a bureaucratic empire ruled by fear. These words reached Europe and America, angering Stalin deeply. Even across oceans, Trotsky's pen was dangerous. His home became a place of constant tension. Letters arrived from supporters, but also threats. Newspapers speculated about his future. Some admired his courage, others called him obsolete. The Turkish government, under pressure from Moscow, kept him under watch, but refused to hand him over. Still, he knew he could not stay forever. His exile in Turkey was both a refuge and a prison. Visitors who met him during these years described a man of strict routine and quiet intensity. He kept a small library, studied languages, and took care of his garden with careful pride. He enjoyed feeding his chickens, calling them his peaceful comrades. It was a strange contrast, the man who had once commanded armies now mending fences by the sea. Yet behind that calm surface, the struggle continued. He organised an international movement, the Left Opposition, to challenge Stalin's dominance. Through letters and clandestine meetings, he tried to unite socialists around the world under the banner of true Marxism. Despite his efforts, his influence within Russia was fading. Stalin's control was absolute, and mentioning Trotsky's name had become dangerous. The old comrades who had once marched beside him were now denouncing him on radio broadcasts or facing execution. Each new purge reached closer to the people he loved. In 1933, as Hitler rose to power in Germany, Trotsky's warnings about fascism seemed prophetic. He wrote that tyranny feeds on fear and silence, and that both were spreading. Soon, another storm would force him to move again. Exile, he realized, had no end. In 1933, Trotsky was granted permission to leave Turkey. His next refuge was France, a country that had once inspired revolutions but now watched them warily. Paris welcomed him politely but cautiously. The French authorities, under pressure from the Soviet government, restricted his movements and monitored his visitors. He rented a quiet house in the countryside surrounded by books and manuscripts, and tried once again to live by his pen. Though older and wearier, he still believed in the power of words to fight lies. Every morning he wrote from dawn until noon, then took long walks through the fields, thinking through sentences like battle strategies. The world outside was changing quickly. Hitler had come to power in Germany, Mussolini ruled Italy, and Stalin was tightening his grip on the Soviet Union. Trotsky saw the pattern clearly. Revolution was giving way to dictatorship everywhere. He warned that Stalin's policies would destroy the spirit of socialism, replacing it with fear and bureaucracy. His essays, sharp, analytical and unsparing, were published in European journals and reached readers across the Atlantic. Some admired him as the conscience of the left. Others dismissed him as a man trapped in the past. France, however, soon became unsafe. Stalin's agents were spreading across Europe, and Trotsky's presence caused diplomatic discomfort. By 1935, under increasing political pressure, the French government asked him to leave. After months of uncertainty, Norway offered temporary asylum. Trotsky arrived there with his wife Natalia, hoping for peace. For a brief time, he found it. The countryside was calm, the air clean, and he spent his days writing the manuscript that would become The Revolution Betrayed. His analysis of how the Soviet Union had transformed into a totalitarian state. In its pages, he dissected Stalinism with surgical precision, predicting the coming purges and warning that tyranny disguised as socialism would be one of history's greatest tragedies. But Stalin had not forgotten him. As Trotsky wrote, his friends and former comrades in the Soviet Union were being arrested, tortured and executed in the infamous Moscow trials. Each confession, forced under duress, accused Trotsky of plotting against the state from abroad. He read the transcripts in disbelief. Men he had known for decades were denouncing him publicly. The regime had turned the truth inside out. The pressure soon reached Norway. In 1936, under Soviet influence, the Norwegian government placed Trotsky under house arrest. His mail was censored, his visitors limited, his movements confined to a small farmhouse. Guards stood outside, pretending it was for his protection. Trotsky understood the irony too well. He had once built a state that punished dissent, and now he was its victim. Yet he refused despair. He continued to write secretly, smuggling his words out through friends and foreign journalists. As Europe slid toward another war, Trotsky knew that even Norway would not be safe for long. Somewhere, beyond the cold seas and the reach of Stalin's agents, he hoped to find a final refuge. His last exile was waiting for him on the other side of the ocean, a distant country he had never seen, where his enemies would still find him. In early 1937, after months of negotiation and refusal from nearly every European nation, one invitation finally reached Trotsky from across the Atlantic. It came from Mexico, signed by two artists whose names were already known around the world, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. They admired Trotsky's intellect and his defiance against tyranny, and they offered him asylum when no one else dared. For Trotsky, it was not just a refuge, it was a chance to breathe again. On a cold January day, he and his wife Natalia boarded a Norwegian freighter bound for Tampico. After years of grey exile, the sight of Mexico's bright coastline felt almost unreal. He later wrote that the colours of the country seemed too alive to belong to the same world as Europe. Rivera and Carlo welcomed them into their famous blue house in Coyoacán, a quiet suburb of Mexico City filled with gardens and birdsong. Trotsky's arrival made headlines. He was 67, his beard white, his eyes still sharp and restless. Reporters gathered at the gate each morning, hoping for a glimpse of the revolutionary in exile. Inside the house, the atmosphere was both domestic and charged with history. Trotsky worked in a small study surrounded by books and caged canaries, dictating letters and articles that continued his war of words against Stalin. His wife tended to the garden. Carlo often joined them for tea, curious and warm, while Rivera discussed politics with fiery enthusiasm. For a time, Trotsky felt almost content. The light of Mexico, he said, reminded him of the open skies of his childhood. He worked tirelessly, writing essays on fascism, democracy, and the future of socialism. He helped found the Fourth International, a new movement meant to preserve Marxist ideals from what he saw as Stalin's betrayal. From his study, he issued warnings to the world about the dangers of totalitarianism and the approaching World War. Though far from power, his words still reached readers across continents. Yet even in this sunlit exile, danger followed him. The Soviet press called him a traitor and an agent of fascism, and Stalin quietly sent orders to eliminate him. Trotsky's house soon became a fortress, walls reinforced with barbed wire, guards patrolling the gates. He carried a revolver everywhere, a strange and grim habit for a man who once dreamed of a world without fear. Still, he refused to hide completely. Friends visited often, including young Mexican intellectuals who listened to him with reverence. He debated passionately, laughed easily, and took long walks with Natalia through the garden filled with cactus and roses. But beneath the calm, he felt the shadow lengthening. Letters from Europe brought news of fresh purges, of friends executed, of Stalin's grip tightening. Trotsky knew that his own time was running out. Each night he wrote until exhaustion blurred the lines on the page, determined to finish his memoirs before the inevitable end. He believed that even if he died, his words could not be silenced. The Blue House became both sanctuary and trap, a place of sunlight and waiting. Trotsky, who had once commanded armies and reshaped history, now lived behind locked gates, surrounded by a few loyal followers. But he remained defiant, convinced that truth, even when whispered from exile, would outlast tyranny. By 1939, Trotsky's refuge in Mexico had become a fortress surrounded by invisible enemies. Stalin's purges were reaching their final bloody crescendo in Moscow, and Trotsky knew that sooner or later the reach of the Soviet secret police would extend to him. Each morning, armed guards patrolled the perimeter of his home, while inside the former revolutionary lived a quiet, disciplined routine. He rose early, fed his rabbits and chickens, then wrote for hours in his study. Dense, passionate pages about history, ideology, and the corruption of power. His words had become his weapon, and the pen his last defence. Still, there were moments of peace. He read Shakespeare, listened to birds in the courtyard, and took solace in the company of Natalia, who never left his side. Visitors described him as kind and calm, though there was always a flicker of alertness in his eyes, as if he was listening for footsteps in the distance. "We live between two eternities," he once said, "the past that haunts us, and the future we may never reach." It was both reflection and prophecy. That year, the world around him was unravelling. Hitler invaded Poland, and Europe fell into war once more. Trotsky, watching from afar, wrote that fascism and Stalinism were two heads of the same monster, both born from fear and obedience. His writings were banned in many countries, but they circulated secretly, passed from hand to hand by those who still believed in his vision. In these final years, he was no longer a political leader, but a moral one, a man standing alone against two dictatorships. Then, in the early hours of May 24th, 1940, the silence of his sanctuary shattered. Around 20 armed men stormed the compound, led by a Mexican communist loyal to Stalin. Machine gun fire tore through the walls, splintering furniture and glass. Trotsky and Natalia threw themselves to the floor as bullets sliced through their bedroom. For nearly 15 minutes, chaos reigned. When the attackers finally fled, leaving one of Trotsky's young guards wounded, the couple emerged from the darkness shaken but alive. "We are not dead," he said quietly to his wife, "and that is our victory." The attack shocked the world. The Mexican government launched an investigation, and Trotsky's security doubled overnight. Floodlights were installed, walls reinforced, and new guards trained to resist any further attempts. Yet Trotsky knew this was only a reprieve. Stalin's determination was absolute. The first attempt had failed, the next would not. In the months that followed, he continued to write with renewed urgency. He worked on Stalin, an appraisal of the man and his influence, determined to leave behind a clear record of the truth. He also began his final diary, where he reflected not on politics but on mortality, on love, on the strange peace that sometimes settled over him in the evenings. "Life is beautiful," he wrote. "Let the future generations cleanse it of all evil, oppression, and violence, and enjoy it to the full." Outside, the garden bloomed. Visitors still came, bringing books, letters, and quiet admiration. But among them, one man would arrive with a different purpose. A young visitor who carried Stalin's final order hidden in his heart. The man who would end Leon Trotsky's life arrived at his doorstep under the guise of admiration. His name was Ramon Mercader, a young Spanish communist whose calm voice and polite manners concealed a deadly mission. Trained by the Soviet NKVD, he had been sent to Mexico with a single purpose: to kill the last living rival of Joseph Stalin. For months, Mercader lived a life of careful patience. He befriended one of Trotsky's trusted followers, gained entry to the household, and presented himself as a sympathetic intellectual interested in the revolutionary's writings. Trotsky, cautious but kind, met him several times, never fully trusting him, yet unwilling to suspect every gesture of friendship as a weapon. By the summer of 1940, Trotsky was exhausted but still disciplined. He wrote daily, read late into the night, and continued receiving visitors despite the risks. He had survived wars, prisons, betrayals, and one assassination attempt. Perhaps somewhere in his mind he believed fate would let him finish his work. His diary from that time speaks of simple things: the weather, the growth of plants in his garden, the affection he felt for Natalia. Beneath those lines, however, lies an unspoken awareness that the circle was closing. Mercader waited for the perfect moment. He knew Trotsky would never lower his guard for a stranger, so he built trust through routine. He brought papers for editing, political drafts, and small gifts for the household. To the guards, he appeared harmless, just another European intellectual seeking wisdom from the aging revolutionary. Even Trotsky's own instincts, honed over decades of survival, could not pierce the disguise completely. The assassin played the role so well that no one saw the shadow behind his calm smile. On the morning of August 20th, 1940, the sky above Coyoacan was clear and warm. Trotsky spent the early hours feeding his rabbits and dictating notes for his biography of Stalin. In the afternoon, Mercader arrived, carrying a typewritten article he claimed to want Trotsky's opinion on. The guards searched him briefly but found nothing. His weapon was hidden inside his coat, wrapped in papers. Trotsky invited him into his study. Natalia was in the next room, and a few secretaries worked nearby. The two men spoke quietly for several minutes. Then, as Trotsky leaned forward to read the document, Mercader raised an ice axe concealed under his jacket and brought it down with all his strength. The blow struck Trotsky's skull, but did not kill him instantly. Trotsky screamed, a sound of both pain and defiance. His guards rushed in, capturing the attacker before he could strike again. Blood ran down Trotsky's face as he stood, still conscious, still unbroken. "Do not kill him," he whispered to his guards. "He must talk." Those were his last words of command. Calm, lucid, human. He was taken to a hospital in Mexico City, where surgeons fought through the night to save him. Natalia stayed beside him, holding his hand. For 20 hours he drifted in and out of consciousness. Finally, on August 21st, 1940, Leon Trotsky died. He was 60 years old. News of his death spread around the world. Crowds gathered outside his house, bringing flowers and candles. Some came to mourn the revolutionary hero, others to witness the end of an era. Stalin's last enemy was gone, but his ideas, scattered like seeds, continued to live in those who still believed in the possibility of a just world. Trotsky was buried in the garden of his home beneath a simple stone engraved with a hammer and sickle, the symbol of a revolution that had both made and destroyed him. The morning after Trotsky's death, the streets outside his home filled with silence. People stood behind the gates, their faces solemn, as guards allowed small groups to enter one by one. In the courtyard, under the warm Mexican sun, a simple wooden coffin rested among flowers brought by strangers. Natalia, pale but composed, sat beside it. She had survived decades of revolution, exile, and fear. Now she sat alone, beside the man who had been her companion through all of it. The scent of roses mixed with candle smoke, and for a brief moment, the house that had echoed with typewriters and arguments was quiet. The news spread quickly. Newspapers across the world carried the headline, "Trotsky assassinated in Mexico." Some called him a martyr, others a fanatic, but almost all agreed that his death marked the end of an age. The last of the old Bolsheviks was gone, and the revolution that had promised freedom had devoured its own. In Moscow, Stalin remained silent, but inside the Soviet Union, the message was clear. No one could challenge him and live. Even beyond the grave, Trotsky's murder was a warning. The Mexican government held a public funeral, attended by thousands. Artists, workers, and foreign visitors walked behind his coffin draped in a red flag. The ceremony was not grand, but it was human, a farewell to a man who had lived in pursuit of an impossible ideal. When the coffin was lowered into the garden of his home, beneath the tall trees and the sound of birds, Natalia whispered a short prayer in Russian. On the stone above him were carved the words, "I have lived, I have fought, I have believed." Ramon Mercader, his assassin, was imprisoned in Mexico. He refused to speak of his orders, insisting only that he had acted out of loyalty to the cause. It would take years before the truth became undeniable, that he had been trained and sent by Stalin's secret police. Even then, Stalin's name was never written in the official reports. Mercader served 20 years in prison and was released in 1960, greeted as a hero when he returned to the Soviet bloc. But he lived quietly, his identity still shadowed by the crime that had defined him. Trotsky's house in Coyoacan remained untouched after his death. The typewriter stayed on his desk, the book still marked with his notes, the garden tended by friends and sympathizers. Over time, it became a museum, a place of reflection rather than politics. Visitors from all over the world came to stand before his grave, not only communists, but writers, students, and those drawn by the strange combination of brilliance and tragedy that his life represented. Trotsky's legacy proved impossible to erase. His writings were banned in the Soviet Union, but they circulated in secret, copied by hand and whispered among dissidents. To many, he became a symbol, not of victory, but of integrity, of the refusal to surrender truth to power. Even those who disagreed with his ideas recognized the courage of his defiance. In exile, he had lost everything except his voice, and that voice outlived him. Years later, as the world plunged into the Second World War, his predictions about tyranny and betrayal seemed prophetic. He had warned that totalitarianism, whether fascist or communist, would feed on silence. And though his body rested far from Russia, his words continued to move like a current beneath history, refusing to be buried. In the years that followed Trotsky's death, Stalin began the final stage of his quiet war against memory itself. Within the Soviet Union, Trotsky's name vanished from textbooks, photographs, and monuments. Images of him standing beside Lenin were carefully edited, his face replaced by empty space or a nondescript figure. The man who had once commanded the Red Army, negotiated peace treaties, and helped lead the October Revolution was rewritten as a villain, a traitor who had supposedly plotted with fascists and spies. The Soviet people were taught that the revolution had been guided solely by Lenin and Stalin, with no room for anyone else. This rewriting of history was deliberate and methodical. Entire archives were sealed, letters destroyed, and those who dared to speak Trotsky's name aloud risked prison or death. Younger generations grew up never hearing of him, and those who remembered learned to forget. It was not enough for Stalin to kill his rival. He wanted to erase the idea that Trotsky had ever mattered at all. It was as though silence itself became a weapon, sharper than the ice axe that had struck in Mexico. Yet outside the Soviet borders, Trotsky's shadow refused to fade. His followers, scattered across Europe and the Americas, continued to publish his writings. The Fourth International, the movement he had founded in exile, carried on his mission, though weakened and divided. They argued over his theories, his strategies, even his mistakes, but they agreed on one thing, that he had died defending the truth of his convictions. His essays on totalitarianism, fascism, and the degeneration of revolutions began to find readers far beyond the socialist world. In universities and political journals, thinkers rediscovered his clarity, his moral courage, his belief that ideas must remain human even in the machinery of power. Inside Russia, the official narrative hardened. Stalin's propaganda turned the revolution into a sacred myth, one that justified every cruelty. Trotsky became a ghost story, invoked only as a warning. State newspapers portrayed him as a figure of chaos, a man whose ambition would have destroyed the nation if not for Stalin's strength. Statues of Lenin now stood beside portraits of Stalin, and the two were painted as inseparable heroes. Trotsky's role had been erased so completely that by the 1950s, most citizens could no longer recall what part he had played at all. But time is patient, and truth has its own endurance. After Stalin's death in 1953, a slow thaw began. The new Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin's excesses, admitting publicly that the purges and executions had been crimes. Yet even then, Trotsky's name remained forbidden. To rehabilitate him would have meant questioning the foundation of Soviet history itself. Still, his writings began to circulate again, quietly, through underground networks. Students copied pages from smuggled books, passing them hand to hand. In those secret readings, Trotsky's words spoke to a new generation, not as orders, but as reflections on how revolutions lose their souls. Stalin had erased his image, but not his influence. Across decades and continents, Trotsky became a paradoxical figure, both condemned and remembered, both feared and admired. And while his homeland buried him in silence, the world beyond began to see him not as a ghost of the past, but as a warning for the future. During the long decades of the Cold War, Trotsky's ghost walked quietly between the lines of history. In the East, he was still a forbidden name, erased, discredited, unspoken. In the West, he became a symbol of something more complex, the revolutionary who had seen too clearly, who had warned too soon. His books, banned in the Soviet Union, found new life in Europe and America, where readers approached them not as political manifestos but as philosophical reflections on power, belief, and betrayal. In libraries and small publishers' offices, his voice resurfaced, calm yet burning, from the pages of The Revolution Betrayed and My Life. Scholars and activists discovered in his writings a strange balance, the passion of a believer and the clarity of a critic. He had lived through the birth of the modern world and witnessed how ideals could twist into tyranny. To many young thinkers in the 1950s and 60s, Trotsky represented the lost conscience of socialism, a man who refused to abandon human freedom even when surrounded by machinery of control. Student movements in Paris, London, and New York cited his words, blending his revolutionary theories with calls for democracy and justice. His idea of permanent revolution, once condemned, now sounded less like extremism and more like a defense of constant renewal, a reminder that power must always be questioned. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, official silence began to crack. After Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin, historians cautiously re-examined the early years of the revolution. Some dared to mention Trotsky in footnotes or academic debates, though always carefully, without emotion. The censorship softened, but fear lingered. To acknowledge Trotsky's role was to reopen wounds that had been buried for a generation. Still, in private apartments and universities, forbidden discussions took place late at night. A few copies of his smuggled works, mimeographed and bound in rough paper, passed from hand to hand like relics. For the first time since his death, his ideas began to breathe again inside the country that had exiled him. In the West, Trotsky's life inspired artists, filmmakers, and novelists who saw in him the tragic shape of the 20th century itself, a man consumed by his own ideals. Biographies appeared, exploring not only his politics but his humanity, his humour, his discipline, his stubborn love for words and life. He was no longer seen only as Lenin's rival or Stalin's victim, but as a writer whose reflections on dictatorship and moral responsibility spoke beyond ideology. Yet even as his reputation revived, debates about him never ceased. Some saw him as a visionary betrayed by history, others as a man whose own methods had helped create the very system that destroyed him. His story became a mirror through which people examined their own time, the balance between justice and power, belief and cruelty, freedom and control. By the 1970s, Trotsky's face, once erased from photographs, began to reappear on book covers, posters, and classrooms across the world. In the Soviet Union, his name was still taboo, but outside its borders, he had become something immortal. Not just a revolutionary, but a warning carved into the memory of a century. His words, once whispered in exile, now travelled through the same channels of thought that he had fought to keep alive. The belief that truth, however dangerous, must be spoken. When the Soviet Union finally began to crumble in the late 1980s, Trotsky's shadow returned to the land that had tried to erase him. Decades of silence began to fracture under the weight of truth. In libraries, archivists unearthed hidden documents, historians whispered names long forbidden, and young readers, hungry for honesty, discovered a figure who seemed both ancient and alive. For the first time in 70 years, the story of Leon Trotsky could be told openly. It started quietly, with cautious essays published in scholarly journals, then with debates on television as the state loosened its grip on history. Many citizens were stunned to learn that Trotsky had not been a foreign spy, as they had been taught, but a founder of their own revolution. The photographs, once airbrushed and doctored, reappeared in their true form. Trotsky standing beside Lenin, speaking to workers, leading the Red Army. It was like watching a ghost step back into the frame of memory. During the years of perestroika, Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms encouraged a limited re-evaluation of the past. Trotsky's works were republished in Russian for the first time since the 1920s. Readers devoured his autobiography My Life and his piercing analysis of Stalin's rule, The Revolution Betrayed. For many, it was a revelation, not just about Trotsky himself, but about how deeply history had been manipulated. He was no longer the enemy of the people, but a man of intellect and contradiction, a revolutionary who had believed too deeply in the power of ideas. Yet even as truth returned, it came with discomfort. To acknowledge Trotsky meant to question the foundation of Soviet mythology. How could a nation that had built its identity on a single version of history suddenly accept the existence of another? Some resisted, accusing reformers of romanticizing the past. Others embraced the rediscovery as an act of national healing. For younger generations, Trotsky became not just a historical figure, but a symbol of resistance to lies. In 1988, Soviet television aired a rare documentary about his life. For the first time, viewers saw the unedited photographs and footage of the man once erased. His voice, recorded from exile, echoed through the broadcast, calm, deliberate, unwavering. It was as though he had finally returned home, not to a country, but to the truth. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, new museums and academic studies began to honor his legacy. Russian intellectuals visited the house in Coyoacán, where his desk and typewriter still stood beneath the sunlight of Mexico. They brought soil from his birthplace in Ukraine and scattered it near his grave. For many, it felt like the closing of a wound that had lasted a century. Yet Trotsky's return to history was not a triumph, but a quiet reconciliation. He had been both revolutionary and critic, both creator and exile, a man who embodied the contradictions of his age. The rediscovery of his story was not simply about politics. It was about memory itself, about a nation learning to look at its past without fear. As the 20th century drew to an end, Trotsky's life stood as a reminder that even the most carefully buried truths have a way of resurfacing. History, like conscience, cannot stay silent forever. In the decades after the Soviet collapse, Trotsky's name gradually moved from the shadows of controversy into the language of curiosity. For younger generations who had never lived under communism, he was not a villain or a hero, but a question. A man whose life seemed to hold every contradiction of the 20th century. Scholars revisited his writings not as sacred doctrine, but as living thought, sharp, self-critical, and startlingly relevant to modern debates about power and freedom. Universities held conferences, documentaries explored his exile, and new biographies presented him as more human, brilliant, flawed, and endlessly restless. In Russia, the rediscovery continued quietly. Once banned works were finally printed in full, and Trotsky's birthplace in Ukraine became a small site of historical interest. Yet the country still struggled to define how to remember him. To some, he remained a revolutionary whose ideas had unleashed chaos. To others, he was the conscience of the revolution, the one who tried to preserve its soul when power began to rot it from within. His story forced Russians to confront the uneasy truth that their history was not a simple line between good and evil, but a circle of ideals and betrayals. Abroad, Trotsky's writings found new audiences in unexpected places. Political theorists studying authoritarianism quoted his early essays on bureaucracy. Activists fighting inequality found in his analysis of class a language that still resonated. Even those far removed from socialism recognized the universality of his warning, that any system, left unchecked, can turn against the people it claims to serve. His insight that revolutions devour their children was no longer just about Russia. It was about every society where ideals collide with power. In Latin America, Trotsky's influence had a second life. Generations of thinkers saw in his defiance a model for resistance against dictatorships. In Mexico, the house where he died became not only a museum, but a symbol of intellectual courage. Each year, visitors from around the world walked through the quiet rooms where he had written his final words, standing before his grave surrounded by cactus and sunlight. The air there carried a strange calm, not of victory, but of endurance. The internet age brought another kind of revival. Trotsky's essays, once smuggled in secret, now spread instantly across digital archives. Students in countries he never imagined could read his debates with Lenin or his reflections on exile. discussions about freedom, class, and moral responsibility took new forms online, and Trotsky's ghost drifted through them all, no longer feared, but examined, quoted, questioned. His life, once reduced to propaganda, now existed as a mirror for human complexity. He had believed that history followed laws of progress, yet his own fate proved how fragile ideals can be. And perhaps that contradiction is what keeps him alive in thought. He was both the dreamer who wanted to liberate the world and the witness to how dreams can harden into tyranny. Today, Trotsky's words are less about revolution than about vigilance, a reminder that truth, power, and conscience must always contend with one another. His exile never truly ended. It simply expanded beyond nations into the collective memory of anyone who has ever questioned authority. Behind the image of the revolutionary and theorist, Leon Trotsky was also a man of deep emotions, fierce loyalty, and quiet tenderness, qualities often hidden beneath his intellect. His life was filled with loss, yet he carried an almost stubborn capacity to love. Those who knew him closely described someone disciplined but not cold, precise yet unexpectedly gentle in daily life. He could spend hours writing about strategy or philosophy, then step outside to feed his rabbits, speak softly to his dogs, or admire the smallest flowers in his garden. These simple acts grounded him when the world around him seemed consumed by ideology and blood. His marriage to Natalia Sedova endured longer than most revolutions. They met as idealists in their youth, united by faith in a cause larger than themselves. Over decades of exile, prison, and flight, Natalia remained his partner in every sense, editing his manuscripts, nursing him through illness, and enduring the loneliness of endless displacement. Their love was quiet but unbreakable. In letters, Trotsky called her my comrade and my home, and even in the final years, when their world had shrunk to guarded rooms and locked gates, they found comfort in small rituals. Tea shared at sunset, long walks through the courtyard, the sound of their canaries. Yet beneath that calm, grief never left them. 2 of their 4 children died young, victims of illness and persecution. Their daughter Zinaida took her own life in exile, tormented by illness and despair. Their son, Lev Sedov, Trotsky's closest collaborator, was murdered in Paris by Stalin's agents in 1938. When Trotsky received the news, witnesses said he stood silently for a long time, his face grey and motionless. Then he whispered only, "We are left with work and memory." It was the sentence of a man who understood that mourning had to coexist with purpose. In his writings from those years, a quieter tone emerges, less the fiery commander, more the reflective observer. He wrote of loneliness, of aging, of the strange beauty of exile. "The stars above my window," he once noted, "are the same that shone over the fields of my youth. They belong to no country." His thoughts often turned to art and literature. He admired Dante, Shakespeare, and even Proust, finding in their words the endurance of human truth that politics could not erase. Those close to him in Mexico remembered his humility. He insisted on modest meals, refused luxury, and lived by routine. He believed that discipline was not a burden, but a form of freedom, a way to remain whole in chaos. Even when surrounded by guards and barbed wire, he never surrendered that inward composure. Visitors expected to meet a hardened ideologue. Instead, they found a man who listened carefully, who spoke softly, who still believed that kindness had a place in history. His humanity, more than his theories, is what endures in memory. Trotsky understood that revolutions begin in the heart long before they reach the streets, and that even in defeat, dignity remains a form of victory. Beneath the headlines and the politics, he was not just a symbol of conflict, but a man who tried, despite everything, to stay human in an inhuman age. Throughout his life, Trotsky lived in the space between faith and doubt, believing fiercely in the destiny of humankind, while constantly questioning the means by which it could be achieved. To outsiders, He often seemed unwavering, almost prophetic in conviction, but inside he carried an ongoing struggle with the moral weight of revolution itself. He had seen what ideals could do when turned into weapons, and though he still defended the necessity of struggle, he was haunted by the price it demanded. In Letters from Exile, he wrote that history was not a straight path toward justice, but a labyrinth built by human hands, where every turn may lead to light or ruin. Trotsky's belief in reason remained absolute. He rejected mysticism, superstition and fatalism, holding that the future was shaped not by destiny, but by human will. Yet there was a spiritual dimension in his devotion to truth, a kind of secular faith in the possibility of progress. He often described socialism as the moral awakening of mankind, not merely a political system, but a transformation of consciousness. In his writings, he returned again and again to one question: how could one fight oppression without becoming an oppressor in turn? The tragedy of his life was that he never found a lasting answer. When critics accused him of harshness during the Civil War, Trotsky responded with uneasy honesty. "I have no illusions," he wrote. "Revolutions are not made with white gloves." He believed that violence in certain moments of history was unavoidable, but it should never be glorified. It was in his eyes a temporary necessity, not a virtue. He feared that Stalin's rule had turned cruelty into a system, stripping revolution of its moral purpose. For Trotsky, that betrayal was more painful than exile. To betray an idea, he once said, is worse than to lose one's life. Yet even as he criticized others, he judged himself harshly. In his private diaries, he reflected on his own mistakes, his rigidity in debate, his failure to anticipate the rise of authoritarianism within the movement he helped build. He understood too late that intellectual clarity could not compete with fear and ambition. He once admitted with a touch of melancholy that the revolution has devoured its own creators, and I among them. It was not self-pity but recognition, a man measuring the distance between his ideals and reality. Trotsky's sense of destiny, however, never disappeared. He often quoted the poet Goethe: "He who strives with all his might is still worthy." It was a creed that guided him through prison cells, battlefields and exile. He believed that even failed efforts to change the world had value because they kept humanity from surrendering to despair. That belief, fragile yet unbroken, sustained him when everything else was lost. In his final essays, written just weeks before his death, he spoke less of politics and more of the human condition, of courage, love, and the continuity of life. "I feel," he wrote, "that I am a small particle of the great cosmic matter. This awareness gives me peace." For a man who had fought the storms of history, it was an unexpected serenity, a reconciliation between faith in humanity and acceptance of fate. Trotsky's struggle with belief and doubt remains one of the most revealing parts of his story. He never achieved the perfect world he envisioned, but his refusal to abandon conscience became its own quiet form of victory. Proof that even in the wreckage of revolutions, integrity can survive. Long after Trotsky's death, his ideas continue to echo through political thought, shaping movements and arguments far beyond his own century. Though the world changed, new wars, new powers, new fears, his writings on power, justice, and the corruption of ideals remained disturbingly relevant. Generations of scholars, activists, and skeptics turned to his works not as dogma, but as mirrors reflecting their own times. His theories, once dismissed as relics of revolution, evolved into frameworks for understanding how authority grows and how freedom erodes. One of his most enduring ideas was that revolutions never truly end. Trotsky's concept of permanent revolution was not just about politics, it was about the constant motion of history itself. He believed societies must renew themselves or decay, that stagnation was the death of progress. Modern thinkers adapted this vision beyond Marxism, applying it to culture, science, and civil rights. Artists cited him when speaking of creative freedom. Economists invoked his critiques of bureaucracy. Philosophers used his life as an example of how ideals collide with power. In the 1960s and 70s, when student uprisings spread across Europe and America, Trotsky's ghost reappeared in classrooms and streets. Young protesters quoted his warnings about conformity and blind obedience. To them, he represented the rebel within the revolution, the voice that refused to be silenced by authority, even when it wore the mask of progress. Posters bearing his sharp profile hung beside those of Che Guevara. Though Trotsky's rebellion was of a quieter kind, one fought with words, not rifles. His insistence on moral clarity resonated with those disillusioned by both capitalist excess and communist hypocrisy. Academically, his influence deepened. Historians re-examined his role in shaping early Soviet history, acknowledging his brilliance as both strategist and writer. Political theorists found in his work a rare combination of realism and ethics, a mind that understood the machinery of power, yet demanded it serve humanity. His analysis of totalitarianism anticipated much of what later scholars, like Hannah Arendt and George Orwell, would describe in their own ways. Even those who disagreed with him recognized that Trotsky's vision of history as a moral struggle could not easily be dismissed. In post-Cold War politics, his name became less ideological and more symbolic, representing integrity in the face of betrayal, the courage to speak truth in systems built on lies. For dissidents in authoritarian countries, reading Trotsky was an act of quiet defiance, a reminder that thought itself could be a form of resistance. For democratic thinkers, he became a cautionary figure, proof that even noble revolutions can breed tyranny if not held accountable. Yet Trotsky's relevance was not confined to politics. In literature, his tragic arc, from revolutionary hero to hunted exile, inspired countless works. Poets saw in him the image of the eternal outsider, the thinker who pays for his honesty. Filmmakers portrayed his final days in Mexico as both epic and intimate, a man confronting death with clarity and dignity. The endurance of his ideas lies in their contradiction, hopeful yet haunted, analytical yet human. Trotsky understood that progress is never pure, that every step forward carries its own peril. His writings do not offer easy answers. They offer warning, reflection, and faith in human courage. And as long as societies wrestle with the tension between justice and power, his voice, sharpened by exile and time, will continue to be heard. Among Trotsky's lesser-known passions was his deep fascination with art and literature, a side of him that revealed how profoundly he believed in the power of beauty to shape human consciousness. To Trotsky, art was not a luxury or decoration. It was a vital expression of human freedom, an extension of the same struggle that animated revolution. He wrote about culture with the same seriousness that he gave to politics, convinced that no true social transformation could exist without creativity and imagination. In his essays, later collected as Literature and Revolution, he explored how art both reflects and transcends its time, insisting that artists must remain independent, even within revolutionary movements. Trotsky saw art as the emotional counterpart to reason, the realm where people rediscover their humanity after the exhaustion of struggle. He believed that a society guided by socialism should not impose strict ideological rules on artists. The artist, he wrote, is not a machine for illustrating politics. He must create freely. It was a remarkable stance for a revolutionary leader, especially when compared to the rigid censorship that would later define Stalin's regime. For Trotsky, art's purpose was not propaganda, but liberation, to help individuals imagine a world that did not yet exist. During his exile, he continued to follow the works of painters, poets, and filmmakers across Europe. He admired Proust's psychological depth, Joyce's experimental daring, and even the Surrealists, whose rebellion against reason fascinated him. When André Breton, the leader of the Surrealist movement, visited him in Mexico in 1938, The two men spent hours discussing art and freedom. From that meeting came the Manifesto for an Independent Revolutionary Art, a document calling for creative independence from both fascist and communist control. Trotsky believed that any system that sought to dictate imagination would ultimately destroy the soul of revolution itself. His respect for beauty was also visible in his daily life. In Mexico, he surrounded himself with nature, caring for his animals and collecting small stones polished by the sea. He once wrote that tending to his garden gave him the same satisfaction as finishing a good page of prose. Both were acts of creation, quiet forms of order against chaos. Even in his last letters, he described the changing light on the walls of his study, the sound of rain on the roof, the colour of cactus flowers. It was as if he sought meaning in every ordinary moment, proof that beauty could still exist even in exile. Trotsky's view of art was not naive. He understood that beauty alone could not save the world, but he believed it could remind humanity why the world was worth saving. To him, art was a promise that life could rise above necessity, that people were capable of more than survival. He wrote that the artist's role was to anticipate the future by sensing it in the present, to show through imagination what freedom might feel like. Today, his cultural writings continue to inspire artists and thinkers who see creativity as resistance. They reveal a side of Trotsky that history often forgets. Not just the strategist or the exile, but the dreamer who believed that revolution without beauty would be hollow, and that freedom, to endure, must live not only in laws or governments but in the beating heart of creation itself. The memory of Leon Trotsky has never belonged to a single nation. Around the world, his image has taken on different meanings, a prism through which each culture sees its own reflection of struggle, justice, and betrayal. In Russia, where his story began, remembrance came slowly and unevenly. For decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, his name remained uncomfortable, neither celebrated nor condemned. History textbooks mentioned him cautiously, acknowledging his role in 1917 but rarely dwelling on the later years. In Moscow, there were no statues, no streets bearing his name. It was as if the country still didn't know how to reconcile the revolutionary it once erased. In Ukraine, Trotsky's birthplace, the memory was even more conflicted. Some viewed him as a son of their soil, a brilliant mind who rose from humble beginnings. Others saw only the consequences of revolution, the famine, the repression, the chaos that followed. His legacy there mirrored the country's own divided identity, caught between empires, between past and future, between pride and pain. Still, in small towns and universities, historians continued to study him, not as a hero, but as a phenomenon, a man whose intellect shaped history even when his name was forbidden. In Western Europe, the tone was different. Trotsky became a romantic figure, the tragic revolutionary, the exile who refused silence. In France, his books remained in print for decades, influencing leftist thinkers and writers who admired his independence from both capitalist and Stalinist dogma. In Britain, his analysis of fascism and state control helped form the foundation for post-war socialist debates. Among intellectuals, he was remembered less as a politician and more as a moral compass, a reminder that revolutions lose meaning when they abandon conscience. In Latin America, his story became deeply personal. Mexico, the land of his final refuge, turned his home in Coyoacán into a sanctuary of memory. The Blue House, once filled with danger, became a museum where visitors walked through the rooms exactly as they were left, his glasses on the desk, his coat hanging by the door. For many Mexicans, Trotsky represents the courage to speak truth from exile, an echo of their own struggles against authoritarianism. Each year on the anniversary of his death, flowers are placed on his grave, not out of ideology, but respect. In the United States, Trotsky's ideas found an unexpected afterlife in academia. Scholars debated his theories, while political groups on the margins carried his banner in protests and journals. His writings on democracy and bureaucracy influenced not only radicals, but also historians of power and governance. Over time, Trotsky the revolutionary faded into Trotsky the thinker, a mind studied, dissected, and sometimes misunderstood. Across the world, the contradictions of his legacy remain as vivid as ever. To some, he is the visionary who foresaw tyranny. To others, the idealist whose dreams unleashed chaos. But perhaps the truest remembrance is not in monuments or textbooks, but in the continuing debate he inspires. Trotsky's story endures precisely because it refuses to settle into simplicity. He is remembered as both builder and exile, creator and critic, a reminder that history is not a tale of perfection but of persistence. In every country where his name is spoken, Trotsky lives not as a fixed symbol, but as a question that still matters. What does it mean to fight for truth when truth itself is dangerous? Freedom was the idea that shaped Trotsky's entire life. Not just political freedom, but the deeper kind that lives in thought, speech, and conscience. To him, liberation was not a single event or decree. It was a lifelong process, fragile and easily lost. He had witnessed how revolutions could turn into prisons, how slogans could become tools of control. Out of those experiences, he formed a philosophy of freedom rooted in responsibility, that true liberty cannot exist without truth, and that the greatest enemy of both is fear. In his writings from exile, Trotsky warned that authoritarianism often begins with silence, not violence, but the quiet acceptance of lies. He believed that every person, no matter their place in society, had a duty to question power. Freedom, he wrote, is always the freedom of those who think differently. Though he borrowed the phrase from Rosa Luxemburg, it became central to his worldview. It was his rebellion against conformity, against the idea that loyalty to a system should come before loyalty to one's own mind. Trotsky saw freedom not as a gift from governments, but as a condition that people must defend within themselves. He admired science for its honesty, for its willingness to face uncomfortable facts, and urged politics to follow the same principle. His critique of Stalin's rule was not only moral but intellectual. A system built on lies, he argued, would eventually collapse under its own weight. To him, truth was not abstract. It was the lifeblood of civilization. Without it, even justice became impossible. Yet his vision of freedom was never selfish or detached. He did not believe in freedom as isolation but as solidarity, a shared commitment to dignity and fairness. He dreamed of a world where education, art, and work would all serve the growth of human potential, not obedience. In that sense, his socialism was less about economics than about spirit, the idea that people could become more human through cooperation and creativity. To be free, he wrote, is to feel responsible for others. Trotsky's exile tested that belief constantly. He was physically confined, watched, and hunted, yet he refused to let fear dictate his mind. In his letters, he spoke of an inner freedom, a strength that no state could confiscate. He found it in writing, in nature, in love. The more the world tried to silence him, the more he turned inward toward the kind of liberty that exists beyond permission. Even when surrounded by walls, he remained unbroken. His thoughts on freedom have outlived the systems he fought for and against. Modern readers find in his words a timeless challenge: how to defend truth in an age of propaganda, how to keep one's mind independent when surrounded by noise. Trotsky never believed that humanity was perfectible, but he believed it was educable, capable of learning, reasoning, and transcending fear. That fragile faith, tested through blood and exile, is what makes his vision so enduring. In the end, Trotsky's greatest lesson may be that freedom begins not with governments or revolutions, but with the courage to think and to keep thinking, even when the world demands silence. His life stands as both warning and inspiration, that truth without freedom dies, and freedom without truth is only another form of illusion. Exile defined Leon Trotsky more than any title or achievement. It was both his punishment and his education, a condition that stripped away illusion and forced him to see the world without borders. Over 2 decades, he lived in more than a dozen cities across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Each place gave him shelter for a time, but none could become home. "I carry my country inside me," he once wrote, "and it has no map." That sentence captures the paradox of his existence. The man who dreamed of a global revolution became a permanent outsider, wandering the very world he had hoped to unite. Exile taught Trotsky endurance. Every departure meant abandoning libraries, manuscripts, and friends. Every arrival meant suspicion and surveillance. Yet he never allowed displacement to harden into bitterness. Instead, he turned exile into a form of perspective. From Vienna to Paris, from Principe to Mexico, he watched societies from the edges, free to observe their contradictions. He saw how power operated differently in each country, but how fear and conformity took root everywhere. This distance sharpened his insight, the clarity of someone who no longer belonged to any system and could therefore judge them all. The loneliness of exile, however, left deep scars. He wrote of the pain of losing language, the way familiar words fade when one moves from country to country, until even speech feels foreign. Letters became his lifeline. He wrote thousands of them, sometimes just to keep his mind from drowning in silence. To be exiled, he said, is to fight daily against forgetting who you are. Natalia shared that burden, creating small rituals to keep normalcy alive. Morning tea, walks, the sound of music in the background of endless writing. They learned to build a kind of portable home in the rhythm of their companionship. Exile also gave Trotsky a universal vision. Having lived among workers in Russia, intellectuals in France, and peasants in Mexico, he came to see humanity less in national terms and more as a shared struggle for dignity. "The earth is wide," he wrote near the end of his life, "but injustice travels faster than light." That awareness made him both compassionate and impatient. He admired ordinary people's courage but despised complacency, believing that comfort was the enemy of progress. He felt closest to those who, like him, lived on the margins: writers, dissidents, refugees, people displaced by history yet unwilling to surrender. The longer he remained in exile, the more Trotsky redefined belonging itself. For him, identity became a moral stance rather than a place. He belonged to truth, to the pursuit of justice, to the small and fragile brotherhood of those who refused to conform. This inner belonging gave his life a strange stability amid constant motion. Even as governments expelled him, he never felt rootless. He often said that exile had made him a citizen of the world and of the future. Today, in a world still marked by migration and displacement, Trotsky's experience resonates in new ways. His letters from exile speak not just of politics, but of the human need for connection, for meaning in movement. They remind us that exile is not only loss, it is also the discovery of what cannot be taken away. For Trotsky, that unbreakable core was thought, courage, and love. The 3 things that outlast every border. The story of Leon Trotsky is often told through speeches and battles, but behind every chapter stood women whose strength, intellect, and endurance shaped his life in ways history seldom records. Chief among them was his wife, Natalia Sedova, his partner in both revolution and exile. She was more than a companion. She was his editor, archivist, and the steady rhythm in his restless existence. For over 40 years, Natalia shared Trotsky's wanderings, facing prison, illness, and loss with unwavering calm. She preserved his papers through raids, smuggled manuscripts out of danger, and managed the fragile peace of their daily lives. "Without Natalia," he once wrote, "I would have drowned long ago in the debris of our struggle." Her devotion gave him the stability to keep writing, even when the world was collapsing around them. Natalia came from an educated family and was deeply immersed in art and literature. While Trotsky debated politics, she collected books and studied museums. Their home, whether a Moscow apartment or a small house in exile, always contained paintings, sculptures, and shelves of poetry. In her presence, Trotsky found gentleness, a counterbalance to his relentless intellect. Friends said she was the only one who could interrupt him mid-sentence without offence. She carried herself with quiet dignity, rarely speaking in public, yet her calm decisiveness often determined practical survival. From arranging secret meetings to negotiating with foreign officials for asylum. Beyond Natalia, there were other women who marked Trotsky's path. In his youth, his first wife, Alexandra Sokolovskaya, introduced him to revolutionary politics. They married while both were exiled in Siberia, united by ideas more than romance. She bore him 2 daughters and encouraged his early writings. Even after their separation, Trotsky respected her as an intellectual equal. Tragically, she later perished during Stalin's purges, one of countless victims of the state she once helped to build. Their daughters, Zinaida and Nina, met similar fates, one dying of illness, the other likely executed. These personal losses haunted Trotsky deeply. He seldom spoke of them, but his letters reveal a quiet guilt that never left him. Another woman entered his life briefly during his years in Mexico, Frida Kahlo. Brilliant, impulsive, and fiercely independent, she embodied the vitality Trotsky admired. Their brief affair, more emotional than physical, was born of mutual admiration. Kahlo saw in Trotsky not the politician but the exiled thinker, vulnerable and human. For Trotsky, she was a flash of colour in an increasingly grey existence. Their friendship eventually softened into respect, and the Kahlo-Rivera household remained his refuge until his final months. The women around Trotsky were not merely companions, they were mirrors reflecting different facets of his humanity: intellect, tenderness, guilt, and endurance. Through them, we see the private Trotsky, a man capable of affection and humour, one who wrote love letters and admired art as much as revolution. He once said that the measure of civilization is found in how deeply it allows people to love. In that sense, despite his many exiles, he never truly lost civilization. He carried it with him in the loyalty of the women who stood beside him. After Trotsky's death, Natalia devoted her remaining years to preserving his legacy. She guarded his writings, corresponded with historians, and ensured that his ideas would not vanish into Stalin's darkness. When she died in 1962, she was buried near their home in Mexico, close to the man she had followed across continents. Together, even in death, they remained what they had always been. 2 exiles bound not only by ideology, but by love that outlasted revolution. In the final years of his life, exile became Trotsky's library. Surrounded by stacks of papers, letters and manuscripts, he transformed his small Mexican home into a sanctuary of thought. The typewriter clacked from dawn until evening, and the sound echoed through the courtyard like the heartbeat of his remaining purpose. Each day followed a precise rhythm: breakfast with Natalia, hours of dictation to his secretary, brief walks in the garden, and then more writing by lamplight. He knew that time was running out, yet his productivity only deepened. "I must finish before they finish me," he once joked, half smiling, half aware that it was true. His writings from this period possess a striking calmness, a tone that combines clarity, sadness, and defiance. In The Revolution Betrayed, completed in 1936, he dissected Stalin's transformation of the Soviet state with surgical precision. It was not an act of revenge, but of documentation, his effort to preserve the truth before it was buried. He examined how the ideals of 1917 had decayed into bureaucracy, how fear had replaced conviction, and how socialism without democracy had become tyranny. The book, smuggled across borders, became both manifesto and epitaph for the revolution he had once led. Alongside political analysis, Trotsky wrote essays on culture, history, and philosophy. His reflections on literature and art revealed a deep awareness that humanity's progress could not be measured only by economics or power, but by imagination. He saw creativity as the ultimate rebellion, proof that people could rise above their conditions. In those essays, his voice softened. The revolutionary commander of the Red Army spoke now like a teacher addressing future generations. Perhaps his most personal work was his unfinished biography of Stalin. It consumed him in his last months, a final confrontation with the man who had hunted him for decades. He approached it not with hatred, but with curiosity, analysing Stalin as a product of history, shaped by paranoia, ambition, and mediocrity. Trotsky's goal was not vengeance, but understanding. To explain is not to justify, he wrote. He believed that only by understanding tyranny could humanity avoid repeating it. His diaries from 1939 and 1940, discovered after his death, reveal a man surprisingly at peace. Between notes on writing and politics, he recorded small details: the colour of the morning sky, the behaviour of his pets, dreams he could still recall at dawn. There are moments of tenderness, lines about Natalia's patience, gratitude for his friends, and wonder at the resilience of life. Even while under threat, he refused to surrender to despair. Old age, he noted, is a battle of memory against time. I will not yield. In his final entry, written only days before the attack that would end his life, Trotsky reflected on existence itself. Life is beautiful, he wrote. Let future generations cleanse it of all evil, oppression, and violence, and enjoy it to the full. Those were his last words to the world, neither political nor ideological, but human. They carried no bitterness, only hope that others might live the peace he was denied. When historians read those pages today, they see not only a revolutionary's farewell, but an artist's conclusion, the final note of a symphony written in exile. Trotsky had lost everything: his homeland, his comrades, his power. Yet through the act of writing, he reclaimed what mattered most: the freedom to speak truth. And in that quiet triumph, his life found its completion. After his death, Trotsky's image began to live a second life, not in politics, but in culture. Painters, poets, filmmakers, and playwrights reimagined him as one of the great tragic figures of the modern age. He was cast variously as hero, heretic, victim, and prophet, the revolutionary who saw too far ahead, punished for his clarity. His story, rich with passion and betrayal, became irresistible to art. The man who had fought for truth with pen and sword was now reborn through brushstrokes, camera lenses, and words. In the mid-20th century, Trotsky appeared on stage and screen as a symbol of intellectual rebellion. Plays in Paris and London depicted him in his final Mexican exile, surrounded by books and ghosts. In these portrayals, he was less a political leader than a philosopher confronting mortality. Actors often portrayed him with quiet dignity. White-haired, reflective, his eyes still burning with thought. Films in later decades continued the pattern. Some romanticized him as the noble idealist, others as a tragic dreamer undone by his own faith. Each generation shaped him according to its fears and desires. In literature, Trotsky's influence was subtler but profound. Writers like George Orwell and Arthur Koestler drew on his life when creating characters who struggle against betrayal within revolutions. Orwell's Animal Farm and 1984 bear the shadow of Trotsky's warnings. The transformation of revolution into tyranny, the manipulation of memory, the rewriting of truth. Though Orwell never embraced Trotskyism, he acknowledged that Trotsky's fate illustrated how idealism could be devoured by power. For Koestler's Darkness at Noon, the doomed revolutionary Rubashov was a clear echo of Trotsky, proud, analytical, facing execution for crimes he never committed. Artists found in Trotsky not only tragedy but beauty, the idea of integrity standing against inevitability. Painters in Mexico, inspired by his friendship with Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, captured him amid colour and sunlight, a man of intellect among symbols of earth and revolution. Murals depicting Trotsky often showed him holding a book, not a weapon, the thinker who believed that words could outlast empires. His face, framed by a white beard and glasses, became an icon of defiance, appearing on posters, album covers, and political art through the 1960s and 70s. In academia, his myth shifted again. Scholars examined the Trotsky paradox, how a man accused of fanaticism became the symbol of moral conscience. Biographers portrayed him as both brilliant and flawed, someone capable of immense compassion, yet uncompromising in debate. The more time passed, the less his story belonged to ideology, and the more it belonged to humanity. His exile, once seen as defeat, began to look like victory of character, proof that integrity can survive where power cannot. By the turn of the 21st century, Trotsky existed in many forms. To historians, he was an essential architect of the Russian Revolution. To artists, a poetic exile. To philosophers, a case study in the limits of idealism. Even those who opposed his ideas could not deny the allure of his persistence, the man who refused silence. In an age obsessed with image, Trotsky's legacy reminded people that authenticity, though costly, leaves a deeper mark than victory. Today, his likeness still appears in unexpected places: murals in Mexico City, plays in London, documentaries streamed online. His words, once whispered in fear, are now quoted in classrooms and essays. Trotsky. The myth has become inseparable from Trotsky the man, both idealist and realist, both dreamer and survivor. In art, he achieved what politics denied him: immortality not of power, but of meaning. Trotsky's warnings were written for the 20th century, but they speak even more clearly to the 21st. He understood how fragile truth can be when surrounded by propaganda, and how quickly people trade freedom for comfort or security. His life was a living experiment in what happens when power escapes accountability, when revolution becomes authority, and authority becomes absolute. The lessons he left behind were not instructions for another uprising, but reflections on how to preserve integrity in a world built on shifting narratives. One of his most prophetic insights concerned bureaucracy. Trotsky argued that when institutions grow too large, they begin to serve themselves rather than the people they were meant to protect. Rules replace ideals, obedience replaces thought. He called it the ossification of the revolution, a process by which energy and imagination are drained from social movements until only procedure remains. Reading those words today, one sees not just the Soviet experience, but the machinery of modern politics and corporations, where slogans of progress often conceal systems of control. He also warned of the power of lies repeated until they become truth. Trotsky saw how propaganda reshaped the Soviet Union, how memory itself could be rewritten to erase dissent. He understood that the greatest weapon of tyranny is not violence, but the manipulation of perception, the ability to make people doubt their own judgment. His fight against Stalinism was, at its core, a fight to preserve reality. In an age of disinformation and polarized media, his insistence on intellectual honesty feels almost revolutionary again. Trotsky's writings on moral courage remain among his most relevant. He believed that history does not forgive neutrality, that silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of complicity. Indifference, he wrote, is the deadliest sin of all. Yet he also recognized that moral courage often begins quietly, with small acts of truth-telling, with the refusal to repeat lies. His own example was not of perfection, but of persistence, a flawed human being who continued to speak, even when his words brought exile and death. He warned that fear would always tempt humanity toward conformity. When people grow tired or afraid, they long for certainty, for strong leaders and simple answers. Trotsky understood that this longing is the seed from which dictatorships grow. The only antidote, he believed, was education, not just formal schooling, but the cultivation of independent minds. To him, the defense of thought was the highest form of resistance. The revolution begins in the mind, he wrote, and it dies there first. Modern readers often see in Trotsky not a blueprint, but a mirror. His questions about power, morality, and the cost of conviction, echo through every era that struggles between truth and convenience. He reminds us that corruption does not begin with cruelty, but with indifference, that tyranny thrives not because of the wicked few, but because of the silent many. In the end, Trotsky's warnings are not grim prophecies but calls to awareness. He believed that humanity's greatest strength was its ability to learn from failure, from loss, from history itself. The past, he wrote, is not a prison, but a teacher. And so his voice continues to sound across time, urging each generation to remember, to question, and to guard freedom not as a possession, but as a living duty. Every revolution demands sacrifice, but Trotsky's life revealed how immense and personal that cost can be. Behind the slogans and manifestos lay years of loss, of family, friendship, and peace. He had dreamed of liberating millions, yet by the end of his life, he had buried nearly everyone he loved. His children were taken by illness, suicide, and assassination. His comrades vanished in purges. His homeland rejected him. The revolution had promised a new dawn, but for Trotsky it became a long twilight of exile and grief. And yet, he never allowed that suffering to turn into cynicism. Instead, he treated pain as proof that ideals mattered, that only what can wound us deeply is truly alive. Trotsky believed that history was a dialogue between courage and cruelty. He saw clearly that no great change came without tragedy. But he also warned against the romanticization of sacrifice. We should not worship suffering, he wrote, only endure it when it serves life. To him, the revolution's purpose was to end unnecessary pain, not glorify it. This made him both visionary and vulnerable. He demanded purity of motive from himself and others, often to impossible degrees. That unyielding faith isolated him from those who saw compromise as survival. But Trotsky could not betray the belief that humanity's moral progress was inseparable from its political one, that kindness and justice were part of the same revolution. In his reflections from exile, he often returned to the question of endurance. What gives people the strength to keep fighting when hope fades? For Trotsky, endurance was not about blind will, but about meaning. He once wrote that a person can withstand any winter if he remembers why spring must come. That sense of purpose sustained him through prisons, defeats, and betrayal. It was not victory that defined him, but the refusal to yield to despair. Still, the human cost weighed heavily on him. He knew that the revolution he helped unleash had devoured its own children, that the suffering of millions could not be justified by theory. His later writings reveal flashes of regret, not for his ideals, but for the faith he placed in historical necessity. History does not absolve, he admitted, it only continues. These were the words of a man who had seen too much to believe in perfection, yet not enough to stop believing in progress. The tragedy of Trotsky's life lies in the gap between vision and reality. He dreamed of a society built on reason and equality, yet he witnessed how easily reason bends to fear, how equality dissolves into control. His story reminds us that revolutions, like people, contain both creation and destruction, that the same fire that warms can also consume. But it also shows how individuals can endure even when their cause collapses. Trotsky's courage was not only in fighting battles, but in surviving their aftermath with dignity and tact. Today, his name stands as a reminder of that balance between hope and heartbreak. He paid a price that few could bear, yet his endurance gave meaning to his loss. Through exile, betrayal, and death, he remained loyal to the belief that humanity, for all its failures, was worth the struggle. In his final writings, he urged others to keep faith not in parties or leaders, but in the human capacity for renewal. The most powerful weapon, he said, is the unbroken spirit. Trotsky's life teaches that revolutions are not measured by victories alone, but by what survives afterward, the courage, the conscience, the refusal to give up on a kinder world. His story is not one of triumph, but of persistence, and perhaps that is the greater legacy. Trotsky's philosophical legacy extends far beyond the politics of his lifetime. Though history remembers him as a revolutionary and strategist, his deeper influence lies in his exploration of ethics, the question of how power and morality can coexist. He refused to accept that the ends always justify the means, even when the stakes were enormous. His writings challenge every ideology that sacrifices humanity in the name of progress. To Trotsky, the measure of a revolution was not only in its victories but in its ability to preserve compassion amid struggle. His ethical vision grew from experience, not theory. He had seen how easily ideals could harden into dogma, how systems meant to free people could instead enslave them. This awareness made him both radical and restrained, a man who believed in transformation but distrusted absolute authority. He warned that when leaders claim moral infallibility, they become indistinguishable from tyrants. The road to hell, he wrote, is paved not only with good intentions, but with unquestioned certainties. That insight, born of personal tragedy, has outlived the ideologies that once fought over his name. Trotsky's philosophy centered on the individual's responsibility within history. He argued that every person, no matter how small their role, participates in shaping the moral direction of their time. He rejected fatalism, the idea that history moves inevitably toward a predetermined end. Instead, he saw it as a living process, open to human choice. History, he wrote, is made by those who act when action seems impossible. This belief gave his life its meaning and made his thought universal, relevant to any era where people must decide between truth and conformity. His later works also explore the psychology of belief. Trotsky understood that ideology could be both a source of hope and a trap. People, he observed, cling to systems of thought not just out of conviction, but from fear of chaos. He sympathized with that fear but insisted that courage begins when one steps beyond it. To think freely, he said, is to risk loneliness. In that sentence lies his entire life's paradox, the price of independence and the dignity it confers. Trotsky's intellectual legacy influenced generations of political theorists and moral philosophers. Thinkers across the spectrum, from democratic socialists to liberal humanists, drew from his insistence on moral accountability and power. Even critics who rejected his politics found value in his questions. Was progress possible without oppression? Could equality exist without conformity? Could revolution remain ethical once it held authority? These are questions that outlast ideologies. Modern scholarship often calls Trotsky a tragic humanist. He believed in reason, empathy, and creativity as the highest expressions of human nature, yet he lived long enough to see each corrupted by fear and control. Still, he never surrendered his faith in renewal. He saw history as a moral dialogue, not between nations, but between conscience and compromise. His hope was that future generations would continue that dialogue with greater wisdom than his own. Today, Trotsky's philosophy serves as both mirror and warning. It invites reflection on the responsibilities that come with power, in governments, movements, and individuals alike. His words remind us that the most dangerous revolutions are those that forget why they began. And while his life ended violently, his thought endures as a kind of moral resistance, a testament to the belief that truth, once spoken, continues to act long after its speaker is gone. For Trotsky, the ultimate revolution was not political but ethical, the transformation of the human spirit toward honesty, courage, and compassion. And though history silenced him, that revolution, quietly, never stopped. More than 8 decades after his death, Leon Trotsky remains one of history's most paradoxical figures, a man both defeated and victorious, both forgotten and unforgettable. His body lies in a quiet garden in Mexico, yet his ideas still drift through classrooms, books, and the minds of those who question how power reshapes truth. Time has softened the arguments around him, but it has not erased his relevance. What endures is not just his ideology, but the moral intensity with which he lived, his refusal to accept falsehood as inevitable, and his conviction that integrity matters more than survival. Trotsky's life reads like a modern epic, a peasant's son who became a voice of revolution, a leader who built an army from chaos, a thinker exiled to the edge of the world, writing by candlelight while enemies closed in. He experienced every contradiction of the 20th century, faith and doubt, creation and destruction, hope and horror, and somehow turned them into thought instead of despair. He lived through the age when utopia was tried by fire, and he died knowing that the dream he helped ignite had turned against itself. Yet even in defeat, he refused bitterness. His writings show no hatred, only the quiet assertion that the future still belongs to those who think freely. In a world often shaped by compromise, Trotsky stands as an uncomfortable reminder of what conviction costs. He made mistakes, grave ones, yet he never hid from them. His honesty, even in error, gives his legacy its unusual power. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he never became what he opposed. He died outside the system he had helped to build because he refused to betray his own standards. That paradox, to be destroyed by one's own creation yet remain morally intact, gives his story its tragic nobility. History has a way of simplifying people, turning them into symbols. Trotsky resists that. He was neither saint nor monster, but a man endlessly questioning, endlessly striving. His writings, stripped of slogans, read less like political prophecy and more like letters to the future. They speak of freedom, art, courage, and the need to think, themes that outlast any system. Life is not measured by victory, he once wrote, but by the truth one carries to the end. That line could serve as his epitaph. In the modern world, Trotsky's relevance lies not in ideology, but in example. He reminds us that conscience and curiosity are revolutionary acts in themselves, that the most dangerous form of power is the one that demands obedience without thought, and that exile, whether physical or moral, may be the inevitable price of honesty. His story is not about how to win history, but how to remain human inside it. As the 21st century faces its own storms of misinformation, fear, and inequality, Trotsky's lessons echo like warnings whispered across time. He teaches that revolutions begin in hope, but survive only through self-reflection, that freedom without compassion is hollow, and that truth, even when buried, will always find its way back to light. In the end, Trotsky's life closes where it began, with words that outlast prisons, exile, and death. Words that still remind us that every generation must decide what kind of world it wishes to build and what it is willing to risk to build it. His story is not finished, because its question remains the same. What is the value of truth in a world built on compromise? And perhaps that is why his name still lingers, not as an echo of ideology, but as a symbol of endurance. Trotsky's revolution was never only about politics. It was about the human spirit's refusal to surrender,